Alright, welcome YouTube to this week's movie review podcast. This week we're looking at Apollo 18, which will be a little bit different from my normal reviews. Normally I avoid reading and watching other people's reviews before I see a movie. Because I got delayed watching this, I did check out other people's reviews. I was originally going to see it over the weekend, but other things came up, so uh, when other people, the Cinema Snob, for example, and Linkar and Iron Liz on Atop the Fourth Wall and thecinemasnob.com, respectively, posted up their reviews. I did take a look at them, so normally I try to avoid that to avoid cross contamination, shall we will, but I did see them, and I think I'll address some of the things if you've seen those reviews as well. But before I get into all that stuff, let's talk about the actual movie here, and whether or not you'll like it or enjoy it. Now, I think at this point most people are going to know whether they're going to hate the movie or maybe tolerate it, based on whether you like the genre, this found footage genre. I don't think it's no longer fair to call it a Blair Witch ripoff. It's become its own subgenre of horror, the found footage stuff. And if you've liked previous found, if you don't mind the gimmick or the premise, the idea of I'm looking at footage that was taken from some sort of source. Uh, so if you don't like that, you don't mind that kind of wink of suspension of disbelief that they find this camera or whatever anywhere, and you watch it and all that. You kind of already know. There's a lot of people that don't like it, and I won't say that they're wrong in saying they don't like found footage movies. It's not their cup of tea, as the British would say. But if you do like it, and I do like this genre, I didn't mind Quarantine, although that had plot holes, and The Last Exorcism and such. So you can count me as a bit of a fan. I do like this found footage genre. I think it has its charms. I don't want oversaturation of the found footage genre, but I do like it as the occasional change in scenery, shall we say, from the usual horror films that you see. And this particular film, though, is about a group of astronauts who go on a secret mission to the moon. And I did address this when I did my first thoughts slash speculation video on this a while ago. And one of the tricks in doing a found footage film is why were the events filmed? And not just why the events were filmed, but once shit goes really bad, why is stuff being filmed? This is what in this film has it gets over that immediately. That's one of the problems I think people would have with the Blair Witch is towards the end especially it got ridiculous why they're still filming this. The excuse on that one was, well, they're film students, so that's their thinking, but not a strong buy. Um, it's much other films such as Quarantine and uh, Last Exorcism also have a good excuse in that they're filming a documentary, so you have the guy behind the camera is a professional videographer who's supposed to. I guess they're the guys that go out and they shoot this stuff and crazy stuff all the time, so you expect them to hold their own and film stuff much more than a regular person. However, even that's a little hard to buy, especially when the action becomes really intense. After all, they really are just untrained civilians, even if you're a cinematographer. You'd have to really buy it that you're maybe a combat photographer or something, a guy that specializes in going out and capturing footage of war. Then that I haven't seen yet. That would be a good excuse to use. But this, and ironically enough, I think Cloverfield might have had just the fact that it's some guy with a really small, easy portable camera that's following around his friends, and he's kind of an idiot to a degree. And ironically, you kind of buy that more than anyone else in this genre. But I think this one might take the cake in having the astronauts. One, they do mix it up a bit. They have both the cameras that they carry and the Paranormal Activity 2 cameras that are set up and filming. So there's outside cameras, there's cameras inside the lander, There's motion sensing cameras outside of their landing zone and such. And the astronauts themselves, of course, one of the big things that they're trained to do when they go to the moon is to film stuff. And hauling around a camera is rather, I guess, easy on the moon with its lesser gravity degree. But also that they're trained and they're astronauts, so they're very cool when it comes to crazy stuff going on. They're very highly trained people. They go back to what I said earlier about there being like a war photographer type guy, and it's easier to buy why they're filming a lot of this stuff because they're specifically trained to film when crazy stuff kind of happens. Well, maybe not crazy stuff, but they're good under pressure. They know that they're supposed to document everything they can possibly document. You still are a little. You still kind of wonder why the one guy's holding around the camera at the very, very end. But I think they would have been better off if it was more clear that the cameras were literally at this attached to the suits and we're just kind of filming. Because they do make it seem like the astronauts are just holding the camera, and I do recall footage from one of the moon landings where it was clear that the camera was almost like built onto the suit and was snap on. So if they did that, it would be. I think they really should have done that as the setup of why. I mean, they might have. It wasn't that clear if there was like a little attachment that they snapped the camera on, because once the camera's attached, you have to wonder. It makes perfect sense of why everything's being filmed. After all, why would you stop in the middle of all this action to take off a camera if it's not really in your way? But alas, I digress. I really should get into what the plot is. The plot is basically that the Department of Defense decided to greenlight a secret moon launch in order to put these sensors on the moon. And unlike to address kind of what Linkara and Larry Liz said, they didn't buy the launching. I did kind of buy it in that they said it was one. They didn't cover up the launch itself. They said that it was gonna. They were just announcing that it was going to be officially it was going to be a Department of Defense launch, and it was implied that it would just be a big satellite that was in there. And after all, this is Apollo 18. The lander and the capsule were probably already completed. So, ironically, I can really buy them being able to launch this particular flight is kind of secret. In that, the number of people that have to keep the secret are much smaller, because it's not like you're constructing a vehicle to just shoot up. Yeah, the construction was public, but then the project was canceled. Everyone, of course, is going to see the launch, but they're acknowledging that the launch is going on. They're just saying it's a DoD launch for like a satellite or something along those lines. So, yeah, I can buy that. And this is important because for a type of film like this, you have to be able to suspend your disbelief, but the film has to give you reasons or give you little tiny things to grab onto to help you suspend your disbelief. It's not just the audience themselves that have to work on suspending the disbelief. The film's, much like a rock climber, has to give you something to grab on. You have to find something on that cliff edge. Just grab on a little bit. It might be small, but it's just enough to keep you going up that cliff. So they go, they fly up, and this is, I think, where the first problem, and the main problem with this film is its pacing. The film it gets way too fast. They cut to stuff very, very quickly, and they move through the plot very, very quickly. And that's a problem for this subgenre, the found footage subgenre. Found footage works best when it's very slow and often shows a lot of the mundane stuff because it kind of builds up this tension. It builds up the authenticity. Once again, we're talking about building on that suspension of disbelief of everything that's going on. You see the normalcy, and then you see the people getting slowly sucked into the world of the unusual, shall we say. And you do that through a slow pacing and building up the characters and such. And this film really, especially before they get to, they're really within just the first minute or two. I mean, it begins with him kind of doing a pre-mission, pre-briefing where the guy briefs, I guess, talks to the camera to tell what their mission is going to be. Standard, NASA fare. Explaining how it's a secret, how he's can't even tell his wife what's going on. But hey, it's an opportunity to go to the moon. And then they kind of cut to that, and they kind of splice in them going off to the moon and kind of the mid travels. And they really should have spent more time, I think, building up their characters while they're on the ship. Yeah, just doing again mundane stuff. Have them just eating their meals and talking about it. Especially since later on in the film, there's 3 astronauts, and for those of you who aren't familiar with how the Apollo programs work, there's the main capsule, which which has a lander that actually lands on the moon. So the lander actually has to wind up detaching from the capsule, and it lands on the moon. There's 3 astronauts. One guy has to stay on the capsule to make sure it's piloted around and picks up the lander later on when it lifts off. So only 2 people go to the moon, and thus you really don't see a whole lot of personal interaction between the 2 guys that go to the moon and the guy up on the capsule there. And I think the film could have benefited more about that relationship between those guys, because after that it's all like just radio conversations. So I think stuff like that would have been better. I mean, and they could also build up the atmosphere, like them kind of peering out and going, we're literally in just a vacuum of nothingness. Where anything goes wrong, we're 20,000, this kind of shooting the banter. This if something goes wrong here, we're like 2,000, not 2,000, we're tens of thousands of miles away from the nearest help, i.e. there is no help. And even have them sitting there and good talking about alien life, speculating on alien life, how it would look and stuff like that, really kind of building up the attention, or even talking about whether they think the Russians could make it, because that comes into play later. Anyway, they do land on the moon, and they wind up setting up some these sensors, which they're told are going to sense missile tests and stuff, which really don't make a whole lot of sense. And this is one of those plot points where they could have really, I think, improved it, because when you think about it just a little bit, you're like, we have satellites. Satellites are much closer to Earth and therefore can communicate much faster about picking up Soviet activity. It's a lot harder to pick up something from the moon. Takes a lot of time to get that information, whatever signal waves to reach the moon, and for the devices to then send it back, which you figure as astronauts they would pick up this and kind of question it. And I think they could have really made a lot better excuses as to why. I mean, they're trying to make it have the whole operation a secret from the get-go. But they could have said, we think the Soviets seem very interested in this area of the moon. This is what they could have said. So we're going to put these sensors here where if the Soviets decide to send in a craft, we can kind of monitor what they're doing. But that would have made perfect right there. You solve a huge... You actually solve a ton of plot contrivances. And the other problem with the pacing that I was talking about, the other problem is they put way too much conspiracy stuff to where it really makes your head hurt. I mean, I guess it kind of fits in with that late 70s kind of government is always conspiring and doing something crazy and stupid, but those are always... The problem with those is it's what I like to call blue-collar conspiracies, because really when you get to them, when you really break it down with anyone with knowledge of how everything operates and how you would keep secrets, like, stuff doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's a lot of problems in it. And so I think if they just had set up from the get-go, we know the Soviets are interested in this area of space, this area of the moon. If they're going to launch a mission, or if they're going to put probes on the moon or anything, they're going to do this. So we're going to send you guys ahead of time to this area, secretly plant some listening devices so we can get an idea of how the Soviet technology really is. We can kind of monitor their communications and such. We can maybe even get, some footage of how their spaceships operate, some really, Class A intelligence. Right there, everyone would have bought why, okay, makes perfect sense. The astronauts would have went, oh, this is why we're being secret. After all, we've been to the moon a ton of times. We'll go there, we'll collect a few extra rocks, but primarily we'll set up for the Russians, so we kind of get an idea of where their technology is. That would have been a perfectly fine excuse, and I think they should have ran with that, because what they do is after they set them up, they show occasionally like a rock kind of slightly vibrating in the background, but they eventually stumble across, after one hearing some weird transmissions, they basically wound up implying that these devices that they set up wind up really drawing the creatures out. But they eventually come across a Soviet uh, landing site. And they find a dead Soviet cosmonaut, which they have the stupidest way of finding him. Apparently, they have this weird flashy light thing. I'm not talking about a flashlight. I'm talking about it's like a camera where they had that, which you wouldn't hear. Yeah, it's got that weird sound to it that I just described, which it's kind of weird because you wouldn't hear that on the moon because it doesn't have, atmosphere. So no sound. This movie should have been really quiet. Really. But I digress with that. Anyway, they find it, they wind up stumbling down this kind of crater, which is very dark, so they have to use this stupid thing. They don't have a regular flashlight, they have this little flash strobe light thing, which of course they use often for jump scares. They don't, ironically, they must haul him up, but they don't show him being hauled up, and the guy freaks out at first when he finds him. I think an astronaut, and I think Linkara hit this on the head too. Linkara and Iron Liz is, these guys, they do a fine job, but there is a level that you would expect an astronaut to be much cooler in this situation. All right, maybe a little holy shit moment, like when he first comes across the corpse, but this guy freaks out for a little while after that. I think an actual astronaut would, he'd have that moment of, oh, what the hell? But then he would go, oh my god, it's a dead Russian. Well, haul this sucker back up. I mean, think about like Apollo 13, both the actual mission and the movie, where literally they have like a good chunk of their ship blows up, breaks off, and he gets on. Houston, we have a problem. Very cool and collectively, and this guy's ship's falling apart. A good example there. Of just how cool an actual astronaut is. Anyway, they kind of wind up bringing it back, and then the weird stuff keeps on occurring throughout the entire time. Again, the rocks, they see the cameras occasionally pick up rocks that move, and it's kind of weird and that they bring in motion sensing cameras that they set up. It's basically implied that, well, I'll get to that in a second. But anyway, first they get back to the ship, and they go to Houston, like, what the. Why didn't you tell us there was Russians? And they go, well, we thought we didn't know that there was going to be Russians. So they immediately start bringing in this conspiracy thing of why, and the question, I should rephrase that, they bring in this conspiracy element, but again, the problem is once you start thinking about it, the question is why would they not tell these guys, if they knew the Russians were there, that, hey, we think the Russians landed in this zone. We think the Russians might have landed in air over here. If they know they're landing fairly close. Now, they could have, one, either played up that they had no idea, which is probably a lot smarter compared to what turned out to be. They could have gone, hey, what? The Russians? Are you sure? We had no idea. Or it was like, they could at least went, wow, we actually... because they talked to a DoD guy, they could have had him go on like, we received an intelligence report. We honestly didn't believe it. We chalked it up to being nonsense, a defector trying to get in, saying whatever he could. That would have been much better, I think, as an excuse, other than going, well, we suspected it, but we couldn't confirm it. Like, you would have probably informed the astronauts, though. Or again, if they went back to what I said earlier, if they just said, we're putting these devices in order to monitor because the Russians are interested, you go, well, now we know why they're so interested. This explains a lot. They secretly landed here. We chalked that up that they didn't actually do it yet, or that it was a test landing. So that must be why our intelligence is saying the Russians are interested in this zone again. And again, that would have probably made too much sense, though. That, if they had just done with that, well, now we know why the Russians must be thinking about landing here again to see what happened to their first crew. And there is one thing, though, Linkara and Liz, again, when they discussed this, they had said, why the Soviets wouldn't announce it. The Soviets actually back then were notorious for not announcing something till they got it off perfect. They really did not like it when they had a lot of cosmonauts actually die. They had a lot of liftoffs that actually blew up on the launch pad. So I would say it's within Soviet characteristics where if they got somebody on the moon and it completely botched, they wouldn't have said anything. They would have went, we'll try again. They weren't even prepared to say that Yuri Gagarin had made it into space and back until he was back and alive. They needed the person to present. If he had died, they probably would have said, "Oh, too bad. We'll have to try again. Hopefully, the next guy will live." Because for the Soviet, it was important to have a hero to parade. But anyway, eventually they start to notice the rocks are starting to do weird things. They notice the rocks are not in their sample cases. They start coming out. Yeah, they just find the rocks like laying on the floor. Like, where did this come from? I put my samples away. Now it's contaminated. And slowly, eventually, before they left off, they notice one, their flags get knocked down. Their lunar rover gets knocked over. And like, what the hell's going on? Actually, that's before they actually try lifting off, and all of a sudden there's an attack or something happens, and they can't lift off. Their ship is damaged. The rover's been thrown over. The one guy, he goes out. It's like, okay, I gotta flip this rover over because apparently that's where their transmitter is located on. They go out there, and he starts freaking out, and that's where you see the one quick shot, and it actually might be a longer shot in the trailer where he kind of turns his helmet around. And he's got the spider creature inside his helmet. He's like, oh my god, there's something in my suit. Guy goes out, brings him back in, and he winds up showing in his chest. He's got this freaking laceration on it, and they want to pulling out a moon rock. He's like, how the hell this? He starts, and the one guy puts it down. And he starts poking it with a prod, and eventually the commander, who has got ripped over, just takes a hammer and smashes the thing. And you do hear kind of a yell when this happens, but you don't see any guts or anything. And now I'll get into what I think with the aliens in a second. But anyway, the guy's then slowly out of this wound becomes more and more effective. And he starts talking about starts rambling on about crazy talk. Eventually, he gets to the point where he starts trying to smash the cameras inside the rover, and they're having communications problems. They start suspecting that the devices they set up were actually designed to draw these creatures out, which I guess kind of makes sense. It's implied because they brought these motion sensing cameras, so they're trying to, and the cameras do pick up like on rocks, even moving very slightly. And you kind of get the idea that the DoD was betting that they would, land, activate these things, but it would take some time, and they would lift off. I think was implied is they would lift off before the rocks would really start doing all their crazy stuff, so they can monitor everything from a safe distance. But the creatures started attacking sooner again, and I think Linkara and Liz made a good point. If that was really the purpose, why not just tell them, hey, we think that there actually might be something alive? Because obviously, several members, a bunch of people at the DoD have to know about this in order to plan, develop these transmitters. There maybe not thousands, but there's probably like a good 100 or so people around the DoD that know about this. Why tell the freaking astronauts? You don't have to tell anyone else on the crew. Maybe one or two people on NASA. You can expand a little bit because this is a need-to-know thing. Just go, okay, we think they're, to also have precautions with the fucking moon rocks if you suspect there's moon rocks, which they kind of imply. Why are you having these guys collect them? Or if you're going to collect them, you can put them in nice, secure containers. It would make, this is one of those, it doesn't make any sense why they would keep something secret. These guys are clearly would be on the need to know. They literally do need to know in order to accomplish the task you want them to accomplish. And they can do a better job for you. But anyway, it gets to the point where they're like, oh man, this ship's screwed. We gotta go we're gonna have to make it to the Russian ship. We're gonna use the Russians to escape. Because apparently the Russian ship is still functional. And this guy at this point is just really gone. He's gone to La La Land. They're driving over. He actually winds up jumping off the rover, and it does kind of show that he's got a weird, I guess his camera's going on and off a bit as he runs into this crater. He's like, that's where they're coming from. He goes in there, and it's kind of implied there's this massive spider rock monster in there, but you only see a 1 second fuzzy shot of it, which I do have to give this movie big credits for, is not showing the creatures. Literally, there's about 5 scenes total where there's a creature, and each and every one of those, it's very slightly. Again, like I said, mostly it's just the rocks moving a little bit. And they have one cut scene. They have one scene where they're out of the ship. You see like a little from a tiny little, it's a static shot of inside the lunar. Tiny little crab creature kind of goes across the one shelf really quick. And then later on, it shows part of it walks over one of the cameras while they're sleeping. And I think that's when the guy wakes up, and the commander that's gone a little crazy at this point, he starts smashing the cameras. At first, I think he kind of actually sees the creature, and I think that's what he hits first, and he just goes after the cameras after that. But eventually goes there. Gets into the Cosmonaut vessel. Winds up contacting the Russians. The Russians transfer him over to NASA, which actually isn't as far-fetched. At this point in the late 70s, NASA and the Russian space program were coordinating with each other. They did a couple of joint missions, so it's at least believable that the Russians would have been able to retransmit this stuff to NASA. But at this point, they're going, oh, you're contaminated. You're going to have to stay there. And the guy really starts freaking out. This is what I think is, I would expect even under this type of circumstance, based on what we've seen from astronauts in the past, that they would be much more cool and collected at this time. Yeah, they would be like, oh my God, tell my wife, I love her, and also I think that the point brought up, okay, what's all this about then at this point? Did you know what these things were? And then again, this would have been a perfect opportunity for them to go, yeah, we thought we had heard what the Russians had gotten some transmissions about what this was going to be, what these creatures were. We had gotten that intelligence. We wanted you guys were supposed to plant those transmitters and leave before these. We didn't think these things would become so active. They never had done that in the past with any of the other rocks that were brought back. So, that was a perfect opportunity for them to explain themselves a little bit and to go, we really didn't want to say that there were aliens up here. We know it from the rock samples that were brought back. We found a few that were alive or something. Or they couldn't get in. We didn't think that they would attack you like this. The perfect opportunity for them to kind of plot explain it. Although I still think it would have been better for them to go like, well, there's something alive on the moon, for not to have the conspiracy element. I think it really made the movie dumber for having it, and less, I think to a degree, less scary. It's scarier that the things are completely unknown, and that it was really, the conspiracy was after the fact. But anyway, he eventually, the guy up on the capsule eventually contacts him in the Russian ship, and they're like, screw NASA, come on up. As they come on up, as he's flying on up, I don't know how he didn't notice that there were a ton of rocks on the floor, but as he gets off the moon's surface, these rocks all of a sudden everywhere start floating around. You gotta be wondering like how he did not notice these before. Would have been probably, he was wandering, he was in that ship for a good time. In fact, another thing is, before he launches, the commander winds up coming back. At this point, you're kind of wondering how the hell is he still alive, because the other guy barely got to that vessel. He was like almost out of oxygen, and then he was he must have been in there for a good hour or 2 or 3, possibly even longer, sitting in that cosmonaut vessel, which brings up 2 plot holes. One is how he didn't notice the rocks if he was in there for that amount of time, because he was listening to this tape recording of his son and wife for a while, and he kept on playing it back and forth. And then the other, of course, plot hole is how his commander was able to then show back up at the vessel, because he obviously didn't have that much air. Anyway, he shows up, and before they launch, the creatures pop out of his skull, implying that's what happened to the Russian. But anyway, so as this happens, it's implied that the 2 ships collide over the moon's surface. Now, it's somewhat, they implied that these creatures might have been from an asteroid, because they say, as the one guy goes, now you don't know if this could just be crazy talk, is that's where they're coming from. So you could go, maybe these are just asteroids. Now, I did talk, kind of got sidetracked there, but that. So that would at least somewhat explain why these things are on the moon, because you're like, why would they develop on the moon? What are they eating? It's assuming they eat anything. Why they seem to need humans to reproduce. It would make. I guess it makes much more sense that it's just that it's a. That's how they are. But yeah, I think it's implied that these are kind of like a silica-based life form. I actually remember watching a show on like how aliens might look like, and they tried to really in that show explain how alien aliens would be, and they said, we'd think of only carbon-based life, but if there's a silica-based life out there, it would be like a crystal. We would probably think that it's rocks at first. That's why I immediately thought of that once I saw the creatures clearly. And who knows if these things actually eat. But it is kind of weird that they are able to so easily use humans for their reproduction. It's kind of weird. I'm running out of time here, even with my extended period. I can talk, so I'm going to have to wrap this up rather quickly. I talked a lot about this, didn't I? But overall, though, it still wasn't that bad of a film. Like I said, the pacing, it was way too fast. They needed to slow it down. So and I think the conspiracy elements that they brought in did not help the film. I think they hurt the film. So for this genre, it was still fine. It was still acceptable. If you like the genre, it's worth checking out. But I do think it's nice that it was a very, very original idea and concept, though. It does take in, which is something I want to see nowadays. Because one of the things I'm always amazed when I look at like 80s films is how they're not really based on anything. They're just based on the ideals of the screenwriters. Or occasionally they at least find an original ideal from an author and then bring that up. So it seems to be something that's lacking in Hollywood nowadays, and that's why I did like this. I mean, the monsters were fairly original. The ideals: you go to the moon, and then moon rocks are spider creatures that attack you. I have not seen that anywhere. I can't think of one if it is similar to something else out there. So I do recommend that you go out and check this, because I do support coming up with more original ideas in Hollywood. I am getting tired of the same old the blandness that is nowadays, where it's either a remake, or if they're not doing a remake, it's a callback. It's like a direct callback to an earlier genre, where they're really just taking stuff. Now, why I do, taking elements common to that genre, whether it's the old exploitation films and such, like name escapes me at the moment, but it'll come to me later. But movies like those kind of callback films, like The Expendables. Jeez, what? It took me so long to think of that. Where they're really not introducing anything brand new. So, I do support this film because it is fairly original in that respect, and it's not that bad of a film. It's an okay film. Some people will hate it, though, so beware. This is not a good film to go if you've been iffy with found footage films. If you find them alright, if you love found footage films, you'll enjoy yourself. But if not, unfortunately, this is probably not your cup of tea. Well, that is it for now. Signing off. I know I went a very long time, which is kind of why I don't like to normally go through the entire plot of a film. It takes up a lot of time. Hopefully I won't have to record this. Or re-record it, I should say, because I took too much time. Nothing really else coming out in a while. I'll probably try to I can think of something. Hopefully, if the Minecraft update comes out, I can do a Minecraft review. But that's it for now. Signing off.